Welcome to the FAFSA Leadership Lounge, where we discuss various policies impacting Florida school leaders. I am Michelle White, Executive Director of the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I'm Jessica Janasiewicz, and I serve as the lobbyist for FAFSA and a number of school districts here in Florida. So you probably saw the headlines. After a 40-plus day extension, the Florida Legislature finally wrapped up the 2025 regular session just before midnight on Monday, June 16th. Lawmakers passed the state's budget for the 25-26 fiscal year, including the General Appropriations Act and a series of related bills, and officially adjourned sine die.
Yay!
Thank goodness. Now, this session was anything but easy. There were deep differences between the House and the Senate on spending priorities and tax policy, and that meant that negotiations took extra time. Ultimately, leadership had to work through those sticking points to allocate general revenue and finalize the state budget. If you've been following along with us, then you know that the budget was always going to be tight this year. Lawmakers were staring down projected shortfalls of nearly $3 billion for the 26-27 fiscal year and nearly $7 billion the year after that. This year's budget reflects major shifts that are aimed at getting us away from that fiscal cliff, but it came with trade-offs. One of the biggest areas that was hit, public education. As we said before, when it comes to funding this year, the soup is thin. What happens next is going to depend on a lot of moving parts, both here and at home and globally. While strategies adopted this session may stabilize things in the short term, the economic outlook for Florida schools will continue to be shaped by broader trends. The funding decisions that were made for the 25-26 budget year will require school boards and superintendents across the state to rework their budgets and possibly rethink their operations for years to come. These changes in education policy are already starting to reshape the fiscal landscape at the district level, and we'll break down what that looks like in the numbers coming up.
Absolutely. And so one of the more controversial debates during this year's session centered on changes to how the state funds advanced academic programs in public schools. Things like advanced placement, international baccalaureate, and dual enrollment. The original proposal sparked a lot of concern because it aimed to reduce the extra funding, or add-on weighted FTE, that districts receive for students enrolled in these rigorous courses. What actually happened is this. Senate Bill 2510, which is the Education Budget Conforming Bill, repealed the existing funding model for those programs entirely. But instead of cutting funding outright, lawmakers replaced it with a brand new line item in the Florida Education Finance Program. It's now called the Academic Acceleration Options Supplement. And while that's a mouthful, here's what it really means. Rather than weighting individual students for funding based on program participation, the legislature created a separate pot of money, almost $597 million to be exact, and this will support these advanced learning opportunities. So the good news is that the amount is designed to fully replace what was lost with the repeal of the old funding model. And the way the funds will be distributed is pretty similar to how the previous system worked. Of course, there's a catch. The new law lays out strict rules for how this money can be spent. Districts are required to use every dollar for specific authorized purposes related to academic acceleration, and they're not allowed to use it to plug holes elsewhere in their budgets. So while the structure has changed, the legislature is aiming to keep support for these programs intact, just under a new name and with new strings attached.
Another big trend that was shaping the landscape of Florida's public education system is where students are enrolling. We're continuing to see movement of students into the state scholarship programs, which provide funding for private schools and home education programs. And of course, we also have charter schools as a choice option. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, back in the 2022-2023 school year, the charter school enrollment stood at about 382,000 students. Fast forward to the 24-25 school year, and that number has grown to more than 406,000 students. At the same time, the funding is shifting with those enrollment trends. Here's the key point. State spending on the scholarship programs is rising much faster than the overall state investment in the FEFP, which funds public schools. Between this year and next, the state education funding increased by a little over $270 million, but the funding for scholarships jumped to nearly $700 million. This tells us something important. Increases in scholarship dollars aren't just because the state's spending more across the board, they're happening because more students are availing themselves of those choice options rather than traditional public schools. For districts that are working on their 25-26 budget, this may mean tough decisions. Based on current projections, it's unlikely we'll see a major new wave of revenue coming into district schools. So when superintendents and school boards sit down to finalize their numbers, they're going to have to plan accordingly.
Absolutely. And there's one technical but important detail that we want to flag from this year's education budget. It has to do with the FEFP, specifically the first calculation work papers that were included in the General Appropriations Act referenced in Senate Bill 2502. If you dig into those documents, yes, all 43 pages, on page 6, there's a glitch. The formulas used to calculate district funding for the funded family empowerment scholarships in columns 6 and 7 turned out to be incorrect. Now, the good news is this. That page doesn't affect the overall funding amounts, either statewide or for individual districts. But still, the legislative staff have worked on a corrected version and released the revised numbers last Friday.
Meanwhile, the major education appropriations bills, Senate Bill 2500 and Senate Bill 2510, are being finalized. The FAFSA team is reviewing all the amendments from the conference committee and will be breaking those down in detail in our analysis. One item districts will want to pay close attention to is the proviso language for Senate Bill 2500, specifically around salary increases. Here's the headline. Just over $101 million has been set aside for school districts and charter schools to increase pay for full-time classroom teachers and pre-K teachers with at least 2 years of experience, as well as other instructional personnel. That amount equals about 0.54% of a district's base FEFP funding. And on top of that, more than $1.25 billion, or 6.67% of base FEFP funding, is being allocated to maintain the salary increases that were put in place last year. This funding gives districts some flexibility, not just for base pay, but also to help offset rising costs like benefits and other compensation-related expenses. The bottom line is, while there was a hiccup in the scholarship funding math, the broader salary support is intact and aimed at helping districts retain and reward experienced educators.
Absolutely. And so we're also tracking budget details proposed at the federal level because policy never stops. The administration from the president is proposing a 15% funding cut to the US DOE and a handful of changes to key education programs. The summary shows the request for the US DOE is about $66.7 billion, which indicates moving towards closure of the department over time and not in 1 year. Title I funds are recommended to stay the same at $18 billion nationally. The IDEA funding also appears to have a slight increase to about $14.9 billion. However, the plan also proposes to add programs into that funding stream, which will leave funding flat. The plan also folds a number of other programs like professional learning, arts education, and school safety into a block grant that usually is about $6.5 billion. The proposal cuts this funding to $2 billion. Finally, the federal Pell Grant maximums are also proposed to be cut from $7,400 to $5,700. So cuts coming also at that federal level, and there's more time as that budget will hopefully be approved around October is what the federal schedule and yearly looks like. And that's usually when we see in the news the federal government talking about continuing resolutions just to get them through and avoid any government shutdowns. So more news to come for sure.
And so what comes next here? Well, we're going to keep a close eye on what happens at the executive level here at the state, because soon the ball is going to be in the governor's court. He'll have the power to line item veto parts of the budget that he disagrees with. As of this recording, the legislature hasn't officially sent the budget to his desk yet, but make no mistake, his team is already combing through the details. You can bet they're preparing for the decisions ahead, and once the budget hits his desk, we'll be watching closely to see what makes the final cut. And also, certainly, rulemaking from the DOE will be on the horizon as well. In fact, they've already started working on rules for policies that were passed earlier in this session. Each Monday, the FAFSA News Tracker will continue to have updated information on rules and the future schedule for when the legislature comes back to begin work for the 2026 session.
It's going to come so fast.
I'll see it before we know it.
School is going to start in August, and the legislature will be here with more things to connect with. We just want to thank you so much for listening. We hope that as leaders, you are getting to take a breath this summer. Enjoy these moments as you're starting to gather your team and prepare for this next school year. We are here to support you and share the latest updates. Of course, we encourage you to please share the FAFSA Leadership Lounge with your colleagues and be mindful of the newsletters and go to FAFSA.net for more updates. Stay tuned and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lounge podcast presented by the Florida Association of School Administrators. Today's podcast was hosted by Michelle White and Jessica Janasiewicz. The podcast is produced by Jeff Willoughby. Special thanks to musical director David Higgins. Make sure to subscribe to the Leadership Lounge podcast wherever you find your favorite podcasts. New episodes are released each Monday. For show topic suggestions, questions, or comments, please email communications@fasa.net. We hope you enjoyed the show.